Up until now, we've been working with raster-based graphics inside of Illustrator, and they've just stayed in their raster or bitmap format. But now we're going to explore how we can begin to convert those raster graphics into vector format. Illustrator has a great feature called Image Trace, which is a new version of the old Live Trace feature. And in Illustrator CS6, it's gotten a lot better and a lot faster. Basically, what this allows you to do is take a bitmap graphic, a JPEG, a TIFF, a GIF, whatever it might be, and then trace it using an automatic command inside of Illustrator and convert it into a vector format. Let's take a look. I'm going to create a new document by hitting Command and Control N on my keyboard. And I'll just use the letter size, and I'll make sure it's horizontal orientation, and I'll hit OK. You can create any size document you want, doesn't really matter. I'm going to go up to the File menu now, and I'm going to place in a graphic. I'll go to my Chapter 12 folder, go into Images, and I'll place in the red paint. Once I place in red paint, I'll just shrink it down a little bit to fit right in the middle of our document. And I'm going to bring up the Image Trace panel. And I'm going to do that by going to the Window menu and choosing Image Trace. The Image Trace panel has a ton of options in it, but for now, let's just worry about these top few right here. If I hover over these, you're going to see that it gives me several different presets to choose from, like Auto Color, High Color, Low Color, Grayscale, Black and White, and Outline. Let's take a look at how these affect the image and the tracing results that we get. I'm going to pick right here Auto Color. If you're using a high-resolution bitmap graphic, Illustrator may come up and tell you that it's going to proceed slowly if it continues to trace this image. Always go ahead and hit OK to this, because this is just merely a warning that it might go a little slow. Tracing bitmap graphics is never an instantaneous thing. So just hit Don't Show Again and hit OK. As you can see, Illustrator's going through and it's actually clustering pixels together, it's analyzing the photo, and it's going through and vectorizing it for you. Once it finishes, you'll have a great representation of this in a vector format. Depending on which preset you click, it's going to look different each and every time, which is kind of interesting. So now that it's finished with the tracing, you can see that it's done a pretty decent job of tracing it. It doesn't look photorealistic by any means, but considering what it had to work with, it didn't do such a bad job. Let's try one of the other ones. I'll try High Color. Once the High Color preset is finished rendering, you can see that it's done a pretty decent job of making this look almost photorealistic. Compared to the original, it's almost the same. Let's take a look at one of these other ones, like Low Color. When Low Color finishes rendering, it's got almost the same photorealistic properties as the previous one, only this time it doesn't go out and get all of the subtle differences between the colors, so it looks a little bit more muted in this case. You also have the ability to choose Grayscale, which is going to give you a complete grayscale rendering of the object that you're tracing. The grayscale rendering is usually a little bit faster than the previous three simply because it doesn't have to deal with so many colors. It just has to deal with shades of gray. You also have Black and White. Black and White's going to be one of the faster ones. Once Black and White renders, you get just exactly what it says. You get black and you get white. Basically what Illustrator does here is it goes into the image and it analyzes things. Anything that is darker than 50% gray automatically becomes black inside the image. Anything that's lighter than 50% gray automatically becomes white in the image. Now you can adjust the settings underneath here, but just the basic trace here gives you this type of result. If you're going for some sort of silhouette on a person, this is perfect. But for this particular piece of artwork, it doesn't work all that great. And then finally we have the Outline mode. Outline mode basically goes through and attempts to give you an outline representation of your artwork. In this case, since there's no real definition of shapes or anything like that, it's just a bunch of swirls of paint, Illustrator has a hard time dealing with that, and this is the result you end up with. In my opinion, it would probably be best to use the High Color representation of this, but again, for each project, it's going to be different for you. Let's continue to explore the Image Trace panel now. I'm going to go ahead and click High Color so that it re-renders, and then we'll explore the remaining parts of this panel. Once the High Color preset is finished rendering, I can then go back down through here. You'll notice that you have access to the presets here as well, but inside of the preset drop-down menu, you actually have access to far more presets than you do at the top of this panel. My suggestion would be to take some time and go through all of these and see which one fits your project best. It's going to be different for each one and depending on your needs. Later in this course, when we go through tracing images and tracing line art, I'll show you some of my favorite presets for each one. Let's collapse this back up and take a look at the view. In the view section, you're going to be able to choose what you're actually looking at on screen. You can view the tracing result with outlines, which looks like this, very hard to see. You can also choose only the outlines, which is just going to show you the outlines of all of the paths. Basically, what Illustrator has done here is taken your original image, which you don't see anymore, and converted it to these thousands of paths, these vector objects that are comprising this and making it look the way it looks. If you look at the bottom of the image trace panel, you're going to see exactly how many paths and how many anchor points you have. Currently, with this tracing preset, I have 23,364 paths. I also have 210,288 anchor points. Can you imagine trying to draw this by hand? That would be absolutely absurd. So in this case, the tracing panel is really saving me years of time. Let's go back up to the View menu, and let's see Outlines with Source Image. So if you want to see your original image with the paths on top of it, you can choose this option. Now it's kind of hard to see the original image because of all the paths, but it is there. And then finally, I can also see just my source image. So this is what the original looked like, and this is the tracing result. Not that much difference. Source image, tracing result. It's actually really close. So you can see that the image trace panel does a really good job, especially with the high color preset that we've chosen. The mode directly underneath here allows you to adjust the color mode that is being used for the trace. You can choose color, grayscale, or black and white. Of course, we're choosing color for this because we want a photorealistic representation of what's going on the screen. You can pick what palette is used. You can use the full tone, which means give me every tone possible. You can use a limited palette, or you can use an automatic palette. If you choose limited palette, you can actually come in and limit the amount of colors that you choose. Once it finishes rendering, you're going to notice that the object becomes a little bit more simplified looking. That's because it doesn't have the broad range of tones to choose from that it did before. You'll also notice under here you have a slider that controls the amount of colors. So you can set the maximum number of colors anywhere from 2 to 30. Right now it's using 30 colors. So in this particular tracing, there are only 30 different colors being represented. That's not a lot considering the fact that you have a spectrum of 256 normally. Let's go back here and let's choose full tone. Once the full tone is finished rendering, you will see here that I get a much more photorealistic representation of my original graphic. Other options that you have here are Document Library and Basic Graphic Textures. The Document Library, you can actually pick from a different document library of tones. So if you have a lot of swatches in a particular document, you can use those if you want to. In my experience though, if you're dealing with a photograph, it's best to use the full tone. If you're dealing with line art, you might want to limit the colors to something like 2, 3, or maybe even 4. But I would keep it under 5 for line art. But we'll discuss that later when we discuss tracing line art. Finally, you have advanced options down here at the bottom of this panel. Inside of the advanced options, you have the ability to control the way Illustrator traces your artwork, and you get to do that in minute detail. You can choose the way the paths fit. If you do a higher value here, that means it's going to fit tighter to the original photograph, meaning it's going to go in and analyze all the curves and corners of the raster graphic that it's tracing and try its best to make the paths fit along those curves and corners. If you drag this slider to the left down to a lower number, the tracing will be faster, but the fitting will be much looser in terms of how closely it represents the overall graphic that you're tracing. Directly under that, you can pick corners. This is called corner emphasis. Basically, it means if you drag the slider to the right, you get more sharp corners in your artwork. If you drag this slider to the left, you get a much more loose and round appearance to your artwork. Finally, you have the noise slider. This is going to reduce the noise in the image, which is just extra little paths and things like that that are left over, by ignoring areas of a specific pixel size. So basically, if you drag the slider to the left, you'll get more noise. If you drag it to the right, you're going to get less noise. Under here, you can pick the method. You can choose either abutting or overlapping paths. Basically, if you choose a budding, that means that Illustrator is going to trace each one of these objects individually and it's going to fit them together almost like a puzzle. If you choose the overlap method, Illustrator still traces everything as an individual object, but they have a slight overlap which helps to eliminate gaps and white space. I actually prefer to do the overlap. It may take a little longer and the paths might be a little bigger than they normally would be, but this is a safe bet to eliminate those white spaces and gaps, and I always like to do that. Depending on what type of artwork you've created and what type of preset you've chosen, you may get the ability to choose whether or not you create fills or strokes. In this case, I'm doing a photorealistic representation, so it's basically just telling me you're stuck with fills. But when you're tracing line art, for instance, it may give you the option to choose strokes, and then you can also set the size of the stroke, making it easier to set how thick or thin the lines are that are being traced around your artwork. You can also snap curves to lines. This looks through your image for any lines that are just slightly curved. If it finds a line that is slightly curved, it then snaps it to a straight line. This can cause gaps and misalignments in your artwork sometimes, so I don't recommend turning this on. However, if you're trying to take something that's been hand-drawn that is supposed to be straight, you can actually make it look even more straight by turning this on. But for photos and intricate artwork, I don't think this works well. Finally, you have Ignore White. If you're tracing a two-color logo, meaning it's black with white space around it or something like that, you can choose to ignore that white space and make it transparent. How many times have you been given a logo by a client? It's a simple logo. It's just black on a white sheet of paper, let's say. You scanned it into the computer and then you took it into Photoshop and you tried to remove the white background and you wound up with all this chunky stuff around the outside of it. Well, you don't have to worry about that in Illustrator. You come in here and you trace the artwork, you refine your tracing, and then turn on Ignore White. All the white space automatically gets removed and you're left with just that logo standing alone. Finally, at the bottom, you have your information panel, which we talked about already, and then you also have the ability to turn your preview on and off. No matter what you're tracing inside of Illustrator, it's always a great idea to have the image trace panel open so that you can come in and tweak your artwork at a moment's notice or switch the preset to completely flip the script on what you're doing.